the progressive governance in Mexico required us to build, from the ashes of neoliberalism, a welfare state, a burgeoning welfare state, of understanding what does it mean to actually be able to materially improve people's lives. My name is José Granados Ceja. I'm a Mexican journalist living and working in Mexico City. I cover Latin America for DropSite News, as well as co-host Sin Muros, which is a show that looks at the Mexico-US and sometimes Canada relationship. So progressive governance in Mexico is different from Canada because in Canada, there is certainly a welfare state that exists, that was fought for, that was won through struggle by the working class, by progressive forces, by interacting with the system. And that, obviously, we know is under attack. In the case of Mexico, we, in a lot of ways, were a testing ground of some of the neoliberalism that we've seen applied. In Mexico, the process of really integrating into kind of a neoliberal model started in the 80s. And that meant that they were able to basically, for decades, pursue this agenda, which was very punishing to the welfare, the interests of the great majorities, the poor majorities in the case of Mexico. The progressive governance in Mexico required us to build, from the ashes of neoliberalism, a welfare state, a burgeoning welfare state, of understanding what does it mean to actually be able to materially improve people's lives. So in Mexico, in 2018, a progressive leftist president was elected, possibly the first leftist president of Mexico since the 30s, to give you an idea of just how monumental this was. But that doesn't mean that the people who had basically run the show for decades, who were deeply, deeply committed to the neoliberal model, were just going to walk away. So they retreat into these conservative strongholds. You know, it's the media, it's the judiciary, it's the electoral authority. And so they try to, again, act against the will of the majorities, of the masses who are deciding, yes, it's time to transform things. So what's the answer? Well, we're not going to let them get away with it, are we? We're going to go after them, push them out of the conservative strongholds, and win even more spaces for progressive ideas, for the redistribution of wealth, for the guaranteeing of all of our social, economic, political rights. You know, it sounds simple, but recognizing, acknowledging that those people who had been marginalized from the system, who had been excluded, who had been left out, that they are visible, that they are important, that they should be the center of any political project. There's a very famous campaign slogan that the ruling party uses, and it kind of transformed into almost to a rule, the golden rule, which is, for the good of all, the poor come first. And so that means putting the poor of Mexico at the heart of all public policy. So what does that mean? It means guaranteeing social, economic, cultural rights. That means having accessible education that is not only free of tuition, but actually providing stipends so students can afford to make it to school, to be able to buy lunch and have the calories they need to learn. It's about creating a universal pension system for seniors. It's one of the most popular social programs in Mexico. We're talking about, people who perhaps never worked in the formal economy and had no access to a pension, who were living in poverty. And now it's not a huge amount of money, right? But it's an important acknowledgement of what they contributed to make sure that they have a dignified retirement. Of course, there's also on the labor front, which has been, the doubling of the minimum wage, which had been frozen for years. The minimum wage was frozen for so long and that it almost had become normalized. There was a sense that it was acceptable. But all it took was the political will to decide this is not acceptable. And so that's in kind of a broad strokes of what progressive governance looks like in Mexico. And whereas I think in difference to Canada is that I think in a lot of ways here in Canada, you're forced to defend past gains, right? And I think while that's of course important, it is good to think about, what does it look like to expand our horizons? What does it look like to feel like more is possible, that you can continue to push the envelope. And that's kind of where the phase we're in here in Mexico now, which is that after López Obrador, his 6-year term ended, there's no re-election in Mexico. His successor, Claudia Sheinbaum, an extraordinary woman in her own right, she always says, I am a representative of a movement. It's not about me, and it actually isn't even about my predecessor. It's about what we're trying to do to transform this country. And that there's a real understanding amongst the Mexican population that this is about really transforming the country. That's why it's called, the moniker that the ruling party uses is the fourth transformation of Mexico. We've had 3 previous, the independence struggle, the reform period, the Mexican Revolution at the beginning of the 20th century. So even that kind of tells you the ambitious nature of their political project. This is what they're setting out to do, and I hope that serves as an inspiration for progressives throughout the world, but particularly here in Canada. And I'll close with this, because I think the relationship, the tensions, the challenges that Canada is facing because of its proximity and its closeness politically, culturally, economically with the United States is very similar to ours. And in fact, I often use it as a reference point. Look what Mark Carney is doing and look what Claudia Sheinbaum is doing. I think the key thing for Canadians to learn is that the masses have to be a central part. Yes, we obviously need political institutions like political parties. We have these spaces like the Progress Summit where we can come together, but everything that follows from this experience, from an election, has to be centered on what comes next and what is the role of the masses in that. And I say that because, for example, to think about some of the things that have been happening over the last year, tariffs. It's a major issue for us in Mexico as it is here in Canada. And the president, Claudia Sheinbaum, has done a great job being able to kind of hold him off. You know, her strategy is the cool head strategy, to keep things calm, don't provoke him, negotiate things at the table. And she's done an extraordinary job doing that. We've actually been able to fend off tariffs on at least 4 different occasions. So it shows that that works. But one of the reasons that Claudia has the confidence in that room when she's sitting across the table from US representatives, from somebody from the White House, or when she's on a phone call with Donald Trump himself, is that she knows that there are millions of Mexicans behind her. That if push comes to shove, they will accompany her as well. And I say that in a really specific way. There was a tariff threat. It was essentially a done deal. Donald Trump had decided, I am going to impose these tariffs on Mexico. And in response, Claudia Sheinbaum calls for a demonstration in the Zócalo, which is that huge public square that's at the heart of Mexico City. And in the interim, from when she announced this demonstration and when it was meant to take place on a Sunday, they reached a deal. 350,000 people showed up that day. And that gave her the strength to say, I can take on this bully. And she has. But at least we know that we have the confidence of the population of the country to be able to continue to push forward, to continue to resist, to know that if things go badly, if the USMCA is not renewed, that it's going to be an economic challenge for us, but we're willing to endure that because there are things that are more important than that. You know, we're not going to let a bully push us around. We're not going to allow them to use their economic leverage to coerce us. We have a project, we have a vision. That project is centered on the poor. It is centered on a redistribution of wealth, and we're not going to let anything get in the way of that. And so what I would say to Canadians is that that part has to be part of your strategy. It has to be part of your thinking at all times. That your same political representatives, which I think there is a mood in this country for somebody to really rise up and say, no more. You know, there was so much enthusiasm from Mark Carney for his speech at Davos when, you know, Mark Carney is a banker. You know, he has the interests of the ruling class in his heart. There is a real strong hunger for this kind of leadership. I don't think it's going to come from somebody like Mark Carney, but I do think that perhaps somebody who's in the room with us here in the Progress Summit is going to be that person. But that they understand that it's never going to be just about them. It's going to be about the movement, the goals, the principles, and about the millions of people who are placing their faith in this individual so that they feel all of the confidence in the world to continue to do what we're all here for, to create a better world, yes, for ourselves, for our families, but also for future generations. Because really, to kind of use an old saying, it does feel like today, it's socialism or barbarism. They know that if we're conscious of our power, that we will wield it, but it's going to affect their interests. So that's our job, to get out there and really utilize the concept of democracy in the broadest sense possible.